Chapter 1. Containing 5 pages of paper. As truth distinguishes our writings from those idle romances which are filled with monsters, the productions, not of nature, but of distempered brains, and which have been therefore recommended by an eminent critic to the sole use of the pastry cook. So, on the other hand, we would avoid any resemblance to that kind of history, which a celebrated poet seems to think is no less calculated for the emolument of the brewer. As the reading it should be always attended with a tankard of good ale, while history with her comrade ale soothes the sad series of her serious tale, for as this is the liquor of modern historians. Nay, perhaps their muse, if we may believe the opinion of Butler, who attributes inspiration to ale. It ought likewise to be the potation of their readers, since every book ought to be read with the same spirit and in the same manner as it is writ. Thus the famous author of Hurlothrumbo told a learned bishop that the reason his lordship could not taste the excellence of his piece was that he did not read it with a fiddle in his hand, which instrument he himself had always had in his own when he composed it. That our work, therefore, might be in no danger of being likened to the labors of these historians, we have taken every occasion of interspersing through the whole sundry similes, descriptions, and other kind of poetical embellishments. These are, indeed, designed to supply the place of the said ale, and to refresh the mind whenever those slumbers, which in a long work are apt to invade the reader as well as the writer, shall begin to creep upon him. Without interruptions of this kind, the best narrative of plain matter of fact must overpower every reader. For nothing but the everlasting watchfulness, which Homer has ascribed only to Jove himself, can be proof against a newspaper of many volumes. We shall leave to the reader to determine with what judgment we have chosen the several occasions for inserting those ornamental parts of our work. Surely it will be allowed that none could be more proper than the present, where we are about to introduce a considerable character on the scene. No less, indeed, than the heroine of this heroic, historical, prosaic poem. Here, therefore, we have thought proper to prepare the mind of the reader for her reception, by filling it with every pleasing image which we can draw from the face of nature. And for this method, we plead many precedents. First, this is an art well known to, and much practiced by, our tragic poets, who seldom fail to prepare their audience for the reception of their principal characters. Thus the hero is always introduced with a flourish of drums and trumpets, in order to rouse a martial spirit in the audience, and to accommodate their ears to bombast and fustian, which Mr. Locke's blind man would not have grossly erred in likening to the sound of a trumpet. Again, when lovers are coming forth, soft music often conducts them on the stage, either to soothe the audience with the softness of the tender passion, or to lull and prepare them for that gentle slumber in which they will most probably be composed by the ensuing scene. And not only the poets, but the masters of these poets, the managers of playhouses, seem to be in this secret. For besides the aforesaid kettle drums and which denote the hero's approach, he is generally ushered on the stage by a large troop of 6 scene shifters, and how necessary these are imagined to his appearance may be concluded from the following theatrical story. King Pyrrhus was at dinner at an alehouse bordering on the theater when he was summoned to go on the stage. The hero, being unwilling to quit his shoulder of mutton, and as unwilling to draw on himself the indignation of Mr. Wilkes, his brother manager, for making the audience wait, had bribed these his harbingers to be out of the way. While Mr. Wilkes, therefore, was thundering out, "Where are the carpenters to walk on before King Pyrrhus?" that monarch very quietly eat his mutton, and the audience, however impatient, were obliged to entertain themselves with music in his absence. To be plain, I much question whether the politician, who hath generally a good nose, hath not scented out somewhat of the utility of this practice. I am convinced that awful magistrate my Lord Mayor contracts a good deal of that reverence which attends him through the year, by the several pageants which precede his pomp. Nay, I must confess that even I myself, who am not remarkably liable to be captivated with show, have yielded not a little to the impressions of much preceding state. When I have seen a man strutting in a procession, after others whose business was only to walk before him, I have conceived a higher notion of his dignity than I have felt on seeing him in a common situation. But there is one instance which comes exactly up to my purpose. This is the custom of sending on a basket woman, who is to precede the pomp at a coronation, and to strew the stage with flowers before the great personages begin their procession. The Antients would certainly have invoked the goddess Flora for this purpose, and it would have been no difficulty for their priests or politicians to have persuaded the people of the real presence of the deity, though a plain mortal had personated her and performed her office. But we have no such design of imposing on our reader, and therefore those who object to the heathen theology may, if they please, change our goddess into the above-mentioned basket woman. Our intention, in short, is to introduce our heroine with the utmost solemnity in our power, with an elevation of style, and all other circumstances proper to raise the veneration of our reader. Indeed we would, for certain causes, advise those of our male readers who have any hearts to read no farther, were we not well assured that how amiable soever the picture of our heroine will appear, as it is really a copy from nature. Many of our fair countrywomen will be found worthy to satisfy any passion, and to answer any idea of female perfection which our pencil will be able to raise. And now, without any further preface, we proceed to our next chapter. Chapter 2. A short hint of what we can do in the sublime, and a description of Miss Sophia Western. Hushed be every ruder breath. May the heathen ruler of the winds confine in iron chains the boisterous limbs of noisy Boreas, and the sharp-pointed nose of bitter-biting Eurus. Do thou, sweet Zephyrus, rising from thy fragrant bed, mount the western sky, and lead on those delicious gales, the charms of which call forth the lovely Flora from her chamber, perfumed with pearly dews, when on the 1st of June, her birthday, the blooming maid in loose attire gently trips it over the verdant mead, where every flower rises to do her homage, till the whole field becomes enameled, and colors contend with sweets which shall ravish her most. So charming may she now appear. And you, the feathered choristers of nature, whose sweetest notes not even Handel can excel, tune your melodious throats to celebrate her appearance. From love proceeds your music, and to love it returns. Awaken, therefore, that gentle passion in every swain, for lo, adorned with all the charms in which nature can array her, bedecked with beauty, youth, sprightliness, innocence, modesty, and tenderness, breathing sweetness from her rosy lips, and darting brightness from her sparkling eyes, the lovely Sophia comes. Reader, perhaps thou hast seen the statue of the Venus de Medicis. Perhaps, too, thou hast seen the Gallery of Beauties at Hampton Court. Thou mayst remember each bright Churchill of the galaxy, and all the toasts of the Kit Kat. Or, if their reign was before thy times, at least thou hast seen their daughters, the no less dazzling beauties of the present age, whose names, should we here insert, we apprehend they would fill the whole volume. Now if thou hast seen all these, be not afraid of the rude answer which Lord Rochester once gave to a man who had seen many things. No. If thou hast seen all these without knowing what beauty is, thou hast no eyes. If without feeling its power, thou hast no heart. Yet is it possible, my friend, that thou mayest have seen all these without being able to form an exact idea of Sophia, for she did not exactly resemble any of them. She was most like the picture of Lady Rainlog, and, I have heard, more still to the famous Duchess of Mazarine. But most of all she resembled one whose image never can depart from my breast, and whom, if thou dost remember, thou hast then, my friend, an adequate idea of Sophia. But lest this should not have been thy fortune, we will endeavor with our utmost skill to describe this paragon, though we are sensible that our highest abilities are very inadequate to the task. Sophia, then, the only daughter of Mr. Western, was a middle-sized woman, but rather inclining to tall. Her shape was not only exact, but extremely delicate, and the nice proportion of her arms promised the truest symmetry in her limbs. Her hair, which was black, was so luxuriant that it reached her middle, before she cut it to comply with the modern fashion, and it was now curled so gracefully in her neck that few could believe it to be her own. If envy could find any part of the face which demanded less commendation than the rest, it might possibly think her forehead might have been higher without prejudice to her. Her eyebrows were full, even, and arched beyond the power of art to imitate. Her black eyes had a luster in them, which all her softness could not extinguish. Her nose was exactly regular, and her mouth, in which were 2 rows of ivory, exactly answered Sir John Suckling's description in those lines. Her lips were red, and one was thin, compared to that was next her chin. Some bee had stung it newly. Her cheeks were of the oval kind, and in her right she had a dimple, which the least smile discovered. Her chin had certainly its share in forming the beauty of her face, but it was difficult to say it was either large or small, though perhaps it was rather of the former kind. Her complexion had rather more of the lily than of the rose, but when exercise or modesty increased her natural color, no vermilion could equal it. Then one might indeed cry out with the celebrated Dr. Donne. Her pure and eloquent blood spoke in her cheeks, and so distinctly wrought that one might almost say her body thought. Her neck was long and finely turned, and here, if I was not afraid of offending her delicacy, I might justly say, the highest beauties of the famous Venus de Medicis were outdone. Here was whiteness which no lilies, ivory, nor alabaster could match. The finest cambric might indeed be supposed from envy to cover that bosom which was much whiter than itself it was indeed, nitter splendens perio marmor pureus. A gloss shining beyond the purest brightness of Parian marble. Such was the outside of Sophia, nor was this beautiful frame disgraced by an inhabitant unworthy of it. Her mind was every way equal to her person, nay, the latter borrowed some charms from the former, for when she smiled, the sweetness of her temper diffused that glory over her countenance which no regularity of features can give. But as there are no perfections of the mind, which do not discover themselves in that perfect intimacy to which we intend to introduce our reader with this charming young creature, so it is needless to mention them here. Nay, it is a kind of tacit affront to our reader's understanding, and may also rob him of that pleasure which he will receive in forming his own judgment of her character. It may, however, be proper to say that whatever mental accomplishments she had derived from nature, they were somewhat improved and cultivated by art. For she had been educated under the care of an aunt, who was a lady of great discretion, and was thoroughly acquainted with the world, having lived in her youth about the court, whence she had retired some years since into the country. By her conversation and instructions, Sophia was perfectly well bred, though perhaps she wanted a little of that ease in her behavior which is to be acquired only by habit, and living within what is called the polite circle. But this, to say the truth, is often too dearly purchased, and though it hath charms so inexpressible, that the French, perhaps, among other qualities, mean to express this, when they declare they know not what it is, yet its absence is well compensated by innocence, nor can good sense and a natural gentility ever stand in need of it. Chapter 3, wherein the history goes back to commemorate a trifling incident that happened some years since, but which, trifling as it was, had some future consequences. The amiable Sophia was now in her 18th year, when she is introduced into this history. Her father, as hath been said, was fonder of her than of any other human creature. To her, therefore, Tom Jones applied, in order to engage her interest on the behalf of his friend the gamekeeper. But before we proceed to this business, a short recapitulation of some previous matters may be necessary. Though the different tempers of Mr. Allworthy and of Mr. Western did not admit of a very intimate correspondence, yet they lived upon what is called a decent footing together, by which means the young people of both families had been acquainted from their infancy, and as they were all near of the same age, had been frequent playmates together. The gaiety of Tom's temper suited better with Sophia than the grave and sober disposition of Master Blifil, and the preference which she gave the former of these would often appear so plainly that a lad of a more passionate turn than Master Blifil was might have shown some displeasure at it. As he did not, however, outwardly express any such disgust, it would be an ill office in us to pay a visit to the inmost recesses of his mind, as some scandalous people search into the most secret affairs of their friends, and often pry into their closets and cupboards, only to discover their poverty and meanness to the world. However, as persons who suspect they have given others cause of offense are apt to conclude they are offended. So Sophia imputed an action of Master Blifil to his anger, which the superior sagacity of Thwackum and Square discerned to have arisen from a much better principle. Tom Jones, when very young, had presented Sophia with a little bird, which he had taken from the nest, had nursed up, and taught to sing. Of this bird, Sophia, then about 13 years old, was so extremely fond that her chief business was to feed and tend it, and her chief pleasure to play with it. By these means little Tommy, for so the bird was called, was become so tame that it would feed out of the hand of its mistress, would perch upon the finger, and lie contented in her bosom, where it seemed almost sensible of its own happiness, though she always kept a small string about its leg, nor would ever trust it with the liberty of flying away. One day, when Mr. Allworthy and his whole family dined at Mr. Western's, Master Blifil, being in the garden with little Sophia, and observing the extreme fondness that she showed for her little bird, desired her to trust it for a moment in his hands. Sophia presently complied with the young gentleman's request, and after some previous caution, delivered him her bird, of which he was no sooner in possession than he slipped the string from its leg and tossed it into the air. The foolish animal no sooner perceived itself at liberty than, forgetting all the favors it had received from Sophia, it flew directly from her and perched on a bough at some distance. Sophia, seeing her bird gone, screamed out so loud that Tom Jones, who was at a little distance, immediately ran to her assistance. He was no sooner informed of what had happened than he cursed Blifil for a pitiful, malicious rascal, and then immediately stripping off his coat, he applied himself to climbing the tree to which the bird escaped. Tom had almost recovered his little namesake when the branch on which it was perched, and that hung over a canal, broke, and the poor lad plumped over head and ears into the water. Sophia's concern now changed its object, and as she apprehended the boy's life was in danger, she screamed 10 times louder than before, and indeed Master Blifil himself now seconded her with all the vociferation in his power. The company, who were sitting in a room next the garden, were instantly alarmed, and came all forth. But just as they reached the canal, Tom, for the water was luckily pretty shallow in that part, arrived safely on shore. Thwackum fell violently on poor Tom, who stood dropping and shivering before him, when Mr. Allworthy desired him to have patience, and turning to Master Blifil, said, "Pray, child, what is the reason of all this disturbance?" Master Blifil answered, "Indeed, uncle, I am very sorry for what I have done. I have been unhappily the occasion of it all. I had Miss Sophia's bird in my hand, and thinking the poor creature languished for liberty, I own I could not forbear giving it what it desired, for I always thought there was something very cruel in confining anything. It seemed to be against the law of nature, by which everything hath a right to liberty. Nay, it is even unchristian, for it is not doing what we would be done by. But if I had imagined Miss Sophia would have been so much concerned at it, I am sure I never would have done it. Nay, if I had known what would have happened to the bird itself. For when Master Jones, who climbed up that tree after it, fell into the water, the bird took a second flight, and presently a nasty hawk carried it away. Poor Sophia, who now first heard of her little Tommy's fate, for her concern for Jones had prevented her perceiving it when it happened, shed a shower of tears. These Mr. Allworthy endeavored to assuage, promising her a much finer bird, but she declared she would never have another. Her father chid her for crying so for a foolish bird, but could not help telling young Blifil, if he was a son of his backside should be well flead. Sophia now returned to her chamber, the 2 young gentlemen were sent home, and the rest of the company returned to their bottle, where a conversation ensued on the subject of the bird, so curious that we think it deserves a chapter by itself. Chapter 4, containing such very deep and grave matters that some readers, perhaps, may not relish it. Square had no sooner lighted his pipe than, addressing himself to Allworthy, he thus began, "Sir, I cannot help congratulating you on your nephew, who, at an age when few lads have any ideas but of sensible objects, is arrived at a capacity of distinguishing right from wrong. To confine anything seems to me against the law of nature, by which everything hath a right to liberty. These were his words, and the impression they have made on me is never to be eradicated. Can any man have a higher notion of the rule of right and the eternal fitness of things? I cannot help promising myself, from such a dawn, that the meridian of this youth will be equal to that of either the elder or the younger Brutus. Here Thwackum hastily interrupted, and spilling some of his wine, and swallowing the rest with great eagerness, answered, "From another expression he made use of, I hope he will resemble much better men." The law of nature is a jargon of words, which means nothing. I know not of any such law, nor of any right which can be derived from it. To do as we would be done by is indeed a Christian motive, as the boy well expressed himself, and I am glad to find my instructions have borne such good fruit. If vanity was a thing fit, says Square, I might indulge some on the same occasion, for whence only he can have learnt his notions of right or wrong, I think is pretty apparent. If there be no law of nature, there is no right nor wrong. How, says the parson, do you then banish revelation? Am I talking with a deist or an atheist? Drink about, says Western. Pox of your laws of nature. I don't know what you mean, either of you, by right and wrong. To take away my girl's bird was wrong, in my opinion, and my neighbor Allworthy may do as he pleases, but to encourage boys in such practices is to breed them up to the gallows. Allworthy answered, that he was sorry for what his nephew had done, but could not consent to punish him, as he acted rather from a generous than unworthy motive. He said, if the boy had stolen the bird, none would have been more ready to vote for a severe chastisement than himself, but it was plain that was not his design, and, indeed, it was as apparent to him that he could have no other view but what he had himself avowed. For as to that malicious purpose which Sophia suspected, it never once entered into the head of Mr. Allworthy. He at length concluded with again blaming the action as inconsiderate, and which, he said, was pardonable only in a child. Square had delivered his opinion so openly that if he was now silent, he must submit to have his judgment censured. He said, therefore, with some warmth, that Mr. Allworthy had too much respect to the dirty consideration of property, that in passing our judgments on great and mighty actions, all private regards should be laid aside, for by adhering to those narrow rules, the younger Brutus had been condemned of ingratitude, and the elder of parricide. And if they had been hanged too for those crimes, cried Thwackum, they would have had no more than their deserts. A couple of heathenish villains. Heaven be praised, we have no Brutuses nowadays. I wish, Mr. Square, you would desist from filling the minds of my pupils with such anti-Christian stuff, for the consequence must be, while they are under my care, its being well scourged out of them again. There is your disciple Tom, almost spoiled already. I overheard him the other day disputing with Master Blifil that there was no merit in faith without works. I know that is one of your tenets, and I suppose he had it from you. Don't accuse me of spoiling him, says Square. Who taught him to laugh at whatever is virtuous and decent, and fit and right in the nature of things? He is your own scholar, and I disclaim him. No, Master Blifil is my boy. Young as he is, that lad's notions of moral rectitude I defy you ever to eradicate. Thwackum put on a contemptuous sneer at this, and replied, I will venture him with you. He is too well grounded for all your philosophical cant to hurt. No, I have taken care to instill such principles into him, and I have instilled principles into him too, cries Square. What but the sublime idea of virtue could inspire a human mind with the generous thought of giving liberty? And I repeat to you again, if it was a fit thing to be proud, I might claim the honor of having infused that idea. And if pride was not forbidden, said Thwackum, I might boast of having taught him that duty which he himself assigned as his motive. So between you both, says the squire, the young gentleman hath been taught to rob my daughter of her bird. I find I must take care of my partridge mew. I shall have some virtuous religious man or other set all my partridges at liberty. Then slapping a gentleman of the law, who was present, on the back, he cried out, What say you to this, Mr. Counselor? "Is not this against law?" The lawyer with great gravity delivered himself as follows. "If the case be put of a partridge, there can be no doubt but an action would lie. For though this be fairy naturi, yet being reclaimed, property vests. But being the case of a singing bird, though reclaimed, as it is a thing of base nature, it must be considered as nullius in bonus. In this case, therefore, I conceive the plaintiff must be non-suited, and I should disadvise the bringing any such action." "Well," says the squire, "if it be nullus bonus, let us drink about, and talk a little of the state of the nation, or some such discourse that we all understand, for I am sure I don't understand a word of this. It may be learning and sense for aught I know, but you shall never persuade me into it. Pox, you have neither of you mentioned a word of that poor lad who deserves to be commended. To venture breaking his neck to oblige my girl was a generous-spirited action. I have learning enough to see that. D.N. me, here's Tom's health. I shall love the boy for it the longest day I have to live." Thus was the debate interrupted, but it would probably have been soon resumed had not Mr. Allworthy presently called for his coach and carried off the two combatants. Such was the conclusion of this adventure of the bird, and of the dialogue occasioned by it, which we could not help recounting to our reader, though it happened some years before that stage or period of time at which our history is now arrived. Chapter 5. Containing matter accommodated to every taste. Parva leaves capiunt animos, small things affect light minds, was the sentiment of a great master of the passion of love. And certain it is, that from this day Sophia began to have some little kindness for Tom Jones, and no little aversion for his companion. Many accidents from time to time improved both these passions in her breast, which, without our recounting, the reader may well conclude, from what we have before hinted of the different tempers of these lads, and how much the one suited with her own inclinations more than the other. To say the truth, Sophia, when very young, discerned that Tom, though an idle, thoughtless, rattling rascal, was nobody's enemy but his own, and that Master Blifil, though a prudent, discreet, sober young gentleman, was at the same time strongly attached to the interest only of one single person, and who that single person was the reader will be able to divine without any assistance of ours. These two characters are not always received in the world with the different regard which seems severally due to either, and which one would imagine mankind, from self-interest, should show towards them. But perhaps there may be a political reason for it. In finding one of a truly benevolent disposition, men may very reasonably suppose they have found a treasure, and be desirous of keeping it, like all other good things, to themselves. Hence they may imagine that to trumpet forth the praises of such a person would, in the vulgar phrase, be crying roast meat, and calling in partakers of what they intend to apply solely to their own use. If this reason does not satisfy the reader, I know no other means of accounting for the little respect which I have commonly seen paid to a character which really does great honor to human nature, and is productive of the highest good to society. But it was otherwise with Sophia. She honored Tom Jones, and scorned Master Blifil, almost as soon as she knew the meaning of those two words. Sophia had been absent upwards of 3 years with her aunt, during all which time she had seldom seen either of these young gentlemen. She dined, however, once, together with her aunt at Mr. Allworthy's. This was a few days after the adventure of the partridge, before commemorated. Sophia heard the whole story at table, where she said nothing, nor indeed could her aunt get many words from her as she returned home, but her maid, when undressing her, happening to say, "Well, miss, I suppose you have seen young Master Blifil today?" She answered with much passion, "I hate the name of Master Blifil, as I do whatever is base and treacherous, and I wonder Mr. Allworthy would suffer that old barbarous schoolmaster to punish a poor boy so cruelly for what was only the effect of his good nature." She then recounted the story to her maid, and concluded with saying, "Don't you think he is a boy of noble spirit?" This young lady was now returned to her father, who gave her the command of his house, and placed her at the upper end of his table, where Tom, who for his great love of hunting was become a great favorite of the squire, often dined. Young men of open, generous dispositions are naturally inclined to gallantry, which, if they have good understandings, as was in reality Tom's case, exerts itself in an obliging complacent behavior to all women in general. This greatly distinguished Tom from the boisterous brutality of mere country squires on the one hand, and from the solemn and somewhat sullen deportment of Master Blifil on the other. And he began now, at 20, to have the name of a pretty fellow among all the women in the neighborhood. Tom behaved to Sophia with no particularity, unless perhaps by showing her a higher respect than he paid to any other. This distinction her beauty, fortune, sense, and amiable carriage seemed to demand, but as to design upon her person he had none, for which we shall at present suffer the reader to condemn him of stupidity, but perhaps we shall be able indifferently well to account for it hereafter. Sophia, with the highest degree of innocence and modesty, had a remarkable sprightliness in her temper. This was so greatly increased whenever she was in company with Tom, that had he not been very young and thoughtless, he must have observed it. Or had not Mr. Western's thoughts been generally either in the field, the stable, or the dog kennel, it might have perhaps created some jealousy in him. But so far was the good gentleman from entertaining any such suspicions, that he gave Tom every opportunity with his daughter which any lover could have wished. And this Tom innocently improved to better advantage, by following only the dictates of his natural gallantry and good nature, than he might perhaps have done had he had the deepest designs on the young lady. But indeed it can occasion little wonder that this matter escaped the observation of others, since poor Sophia herself never remarked it, and her heart was irretrievably lost before she suspected it was in danger. Matters were in this situation, when Tom, one afternoon, finding Sophia alone, began, after a short apology with a very serious face, to acquaint her that he had a favor to ask of her which he hoped her goodness would comply with. Though neither the young man's behavior, nor indeed his manner of opening this business, were such as could give her any just cause of suspecting he intended to make love to her, yet whether nature whispered something into her ear, or from what cause it arose, I will not determine. Certain it is, some idea of that kind must have intruded itself, for her color forsook her cheeks, her limbs trembled, and her tongue would have faltered, had Tom stopped for an answer. But he soon relieved her from her perplexity, by proceeding to inform her of his request, which was to solicit her interest on behalf of the gamekeeper, whose own ruin, and that of a large family, must be, he said, the consequence of Mr. Western's pursuing his action against him. Sophia presently recovered her confusion, and with a smile full of sweetness, said, "Is this the mighty favor you asked with so much gravity? I will do it with all my heart. I really pity the poor fellow, and no longer ago than yesterday sent a small matter to his wife. This small matter was one of her gowns, some linen, and 10 shillings in money, of which Tom had heard, and it had, in reality, put this solicitation into his head. Our youth, now, emboldened with his success, resolved to push the matter farther, and ventured even to beg her recommendation of him to her father's service, protesting that he thought him one of the honestest fellows in the country, and extremely well qualified for the place of a gamekeeper, which luckily then happened to be vacant. Sophia answered, "Well, I will undertake this too, but I cannot promise you as much success as in the former part, which I assure you I will not quit my father without obtaining. However, I will do what I can for the poor fellow, for I sincerely look upon him and his family as objects of great compassion. And now, Mr. Jones, I must ask you a favor." "A favor, madam," cries Tom. "If you knew the pleasure you have given me in the hopes of receiving a command from you, you would think by mentioning it you did confer the greatest favor on me, for by this dear hand I would sacrifice my life to oblige you." He then snatched her hand, and eagerly kissed it, which was the first time his lips had ever touched her. The blood, which before had forsaken her cheeks, now made her sufficient amends, by rushing all over her face and neck with such violence, that they became all of a scarlet color. She now first felt a sensation to which she had been before a stranger, and which, when she had leisure to reflect on it, began to acquaint her with some secrets, which the reader, if he doth not already guess them, will know in due time. Sophia, as soon as she could speak, which was not instantly, informed him that the favor she had to desire of him was, not to lead her father through so many dangers in hunting. For that, from what she had heard, she was terribly frightened every time they went out together, and expected some day or other to see her father brought home with broken limbs. She therefore begged him, for her sake, to be more cautious, and as he well knew Mr. Western would follow him, not to ride so madly, nor to take those dangerous leaps for the future. Tom promised faithfully to obey her commands, and after thanking her for her kind compliance with his request, took his leave and departed highly charmed with his success. Poor Sophia was charmed too, but in a very different way. Her sensations, however, the reader's heart, if he or she have any, will better represent than I can, if I had as many mouths as ever poet wished for, to eat, I suppose, those many dainties with which he was so plentifully provided. It was Mr. Western's custom every afternoon, as soon as he was drunk, to hear his daughter play on the harpsichord, for he was a great lover of music, and perhaps, had he lived in town, might have passed for a connoisseur, for he always accepted against the finest compositions of Mr. Handel. He never relished any music but what was light and airy, and indeed his most favorite tunes were old Sir Simon the King, St. George he was for England, Bobbing Joan, and some others. His daughter, though she was a perfect mistress of music, and would never willingly have played any but Handel's, was so devoted to her father's pleasure that she learnt all those tunes to oblige him. However, she would now and then endeavor to lead him into her own taste, and when he required the repetition of his ballads, would answer with a nay, dear sir, and would often beg him to suffer her to play something else. This evening, however, when the gentleman was retired from his bottle, she played all his favorites 3 times over without any solicitation. This so pleased the good squire that he started from his couch, gave his daughter a kiss, and swore her hand was greatly improved. She took this opportunity to execute her promise to Tom, in which she succeeded so well that the squire declared, if she would give him t'other bout of old Sir Simon, he would give the gamekeeper his deputation the next morning. Sir Simon was played again and again, till the charms of the music soothed Mr. Western to sleep. In the morning, Sophia did not fail to remind him of his engagement, and his attorney was immediately sent for, ordered to stop any further proceedings in the action, and to make out the deputation. Tom's success in this affair soon began to ring over the country, and various were the censures passed upon it, some greatly applauding it as an act of good nature, others sneering, and saying, no wonder that one idle fellow should love another. Young Blifil was greatly enraged at it. He had long hated Black George in the same proportion as Jones delighted in him, not from any offense which he had ever received, but from his great love to religion and virtue, for Black George had the reputation of a loose kind of a fellow. Blifil therefore represented this as flying in Mr. Allworthy's face, and declared, with great concern, that it was impossible to find any other motive for doing good to such a wretch. Thwackum and Square likewise sung to the same tune. They were now, especially the latter, become greatly jealous of young Jones with the widow, for he now approached the age of 20, was really a fine young fellow, and that lady, by her encouragements to him, seemed daily more and more to think him so. Allworthy was not, however, moved with their malice. He declared himself very well satisfied with what Jones had done. He said the perseverance and integrity of his friendship was highly commendable, and he wished he could see more frequent instances of that virtue. But fortune, who seldom greatly relishes such sparks as my friend Tom, perhaps because they do not pay more ardent addresses to her, gave now a very different turn to all his actions, and showed them to Mr. Allworthy in a light far less agreeable than that gentleman's goodness had hitherto seen them in. Chapter 6. An apology for the insensibility of Mr. Jones to all the charms of the lovely Sophia, in which possibly we may, in a considerable degree, lower his character in the estimation of those men of wit and gallantry who approve the heroes in most of our modern comedies. There are 2 sorts of people, who, I am afraid, have already conceived some contempt for my hero on account of his behavior to Sophia. The former of these will blame his prudence in neglecting an opportunity to possess himself of Mr. Western's fortune. And the latter will no less despise him for his backwardness to so fine a girl, who seemed ready to fly into his arms if he would open them to receive her. Now, though I shall not perhaps be able absolutely to acquit him of either of these charges, for want of prudence admits of no excuse, and what I shall produce against the latter charge will, I apprehend, be scarce satisfactory. Yet, as evidence may sometimes be offered in mitigation, I shall set forth the plain matter of fact, and leave the whole to the reader's determination. Mr. Jones had somewhat about him, which, though I think writers are not thoroughly agreed in its name, doth certainly inhabit some human breasts, whose use is not so properly to distinguish right from wrong, as to prompt and incite them to the former, and to restrain and withhold them from the latter. This somewhat may be indeed resembled to the famous trunk-maker in the playhouse, for whenever the person who is possessed of it doth what is right, no ravished or friendly spectator is so eager or so loud in his applause. On the contrary, when he doth wrong, no critic is so apt to hiss and explode him. To give a higher idea of the principle I mean, as well as one more familiar to the present age, it may be considered as sitting on its throne in the mind, like the Lord High Chancellor of this kingdom in his court, where it presides, governs, directs, judges, acquits, and condemns according to merit and justice, with a knowledge which nothing escapes, a penetration which nothing can deceive, and an integrity which nothing can corrupt. This active principle may perhaps be said to constitute the most essential barrier between us and our neighbors the brutes, for if there be some in the human shape who are not under any such dominion, I choose rather to consider them as deserters from us to our neighbors, among whom they will have the fate of deserters, and not be placed in the first rank. Our hero, whether he derived it from Thwackum or Square I will not determine, was very strongly under the guidance of this principle, for though he did not always act rightly, yet he never did otherwise without feeling and suffering for it. It was this which taught him that to repay the civilities and little friendships of hospitality by robbing the house where you have received them is to be the basest and meanest of thieves. He did not think the baseness of this offense lessened by the height of the injury committed. On the contrary, if to steal another's plate deserved death and infamy, it seemed to him difficult to assign a punishment adequate to the robbing a man of his whole fortune, and of his child into the bargain. This principle, therefore, prevented him from any thought of making his fortune by such means, for this, as I have said, is an active principle, and doth not content itself with knowledge or belief only. Had he been greatly enamored of Sophia, he possibly might have thought otherwise, but give me leave to say, there is great difference between running away with a man's daughter from the motive of love, and doing the same thing from the motive of theft. Now, though this young gentleman was not insensible of the charms of Sophia, though he greatly liked her beauty and esteemed all her other qualifications, she had made, however, no deep impression on his heart, for which, as it renders him liable to the charge of stupidity, or at least of want of taste, we shall now proceed to account. The truth, then, is, his heart was in the possession of another woman. Here I question not but the reader will be surprised at our long taciturnity as to this matter, and quite at a loss to divine who this woman was, since we have hitherto not dropped a hint of anyone likely to be a rival to Sophia. For as to Mrs. Blifil, though we have been obliged to mention some suspicions of her affection for Tom, we have not hitherto given the least latitude for imagining that he had any for her. And indeed, I am sorry to say it, but the youth of both sexes are too apt to be deficient in their gratitude for that regard with which persons more advanced in years are sometimes so kind to honor them. That the reader may be no longer in suspense, he will be pleased to remember that we have often mentioned the family of George Seagrim, commonly called Black George, the gamekeeper, which consisted at present of a wife and 5 children. The second of these children was a daughter, whose name was Molly, and who was esteemed one of the handsomest girls in the whole country. Congreve well says there is in true beauty something which vulgar souls cannot admire. So can no dirt or rags hide this something from those souls which are not of the vulgar stamp. The beauty of this girl made, however, no impression on Tom, till she grew towards the age of 16, when Tom, who was near 3 years older, began first to cast the eyes of affection upon her. And this affection he had fixed on the girl long before he could bring himself to attempt the possession of her person. For though his constitution urged him greatly to this, his principles no less forcibly restrained him. To debauch a young woman, however low her condition was, appeared to him a very heinous crime. And the good, well, he bore the father, with the compassion he had for his family, very strongly corroborated all such sober reflections, so that he once resolved to get the better of his inclinations, and he actually abstained 3 whole months without ever going to Seagram's house or seeing his daughter. Now, though Molly was, as we have said, generally thought a very fine girl, and in reality she was so, yet her beauty was not of the most amiable kind. It had, indeed, very little of feminine in it, and would have become a man at least as well as a woman. For, to say the truth, youth and florid health had a very considerable share in the composition. Nor was her mind more effeminate than her person. As this was tall and robust, so was that bold and forward. So little had she of modesty, that Jones had more regard for her virtue than she herself. And as most probably she liked Tom as well as he liked her, so when she perceived his backwardness, she herself grew proportionably forward. And when she saw he had entirely deserted the house, she found means of throwing herself in his way, and behaved in such a manner that the youth must have had very much or very little of the hero if her endeavors had proved unsuccessful. In a word, she soon triumphed over all the virtuous resolutions of Jones, for though she behaved at last with all decent reluctance, yet I rather choose to attribute the triumph to her, since, in fact, it was her design which succeeded. In the conduct of this matter, I say, Molly so well played her part that Jones attributed the conquest entirely to himself, and considered the young woman as one who had yielded to the violent attacks of his passion. He likewise imputed her yielding to the ungovernable force of her love towards him, and this the reader will allow to have been a very natural and probable supposition, as we have more than once mentioned the uncommon comeliness of his person, and, indeed, he was one of the handsomest young fellows in the world. As there are some minds whose affections, like Master Blifil's, are solely placed on one single person, whose interest and indulgence alone they consider on every occasion, regarding the good and ill of all others as merely indifferent, any farther than as they contribute to the pleasure or advantage of that person. So there is a different temper of mind which borrows a degree of virtue even from self-love. Such can never receive any kind of satisfaction from another, without loving the creature to whom that satisfaction is owing, and without making its well-being in some sort necessary to their own ease. Of this latter species was our hero. He considered this poor girl as one whose happiness or misery he had caused to be dependent on himself. Her beauty was still the object of desire, though greater beauty, or a fresher object, might have been more so. But the little abatement which fruition had occasioned to this was highly overbalanced by the considerations of the affection which she visibly bore him, and of the situation into which he had brought her. The former of these created gratitude, the latter compassion, and both, together with his desire for her person, raised in him a passion which might, without any great violence to the word, be called love, though perhaps it was at first not very judiciously placed. This, then, was the true reason of that insensibility which he had shown to the charms of Sophia, and that behavior in her which might have been reasonably enough interpreted as an encouragement to his addresses. For as he could not think of abandoning his Molly, poor and destitute as she was, so no more could he entertain a notion of betraying such a creature as Sophia. And surely, had he given the least encouragement to any passion for that young lady, he must have been absolutely guilty of one or other of those crimes, either of which would, in my opinion, have very justly subjected him to that fate, which, at his first introduction into this history, I mentioned to have been generally predicted as his certain destiny. Chapter 7. Being the shortest chapter in this book. Her mother first perceived the alteration in the shape of Molly, and in order to hide it from her neighbors, she foolishly clothed her in that sack which Sophia had sent her, though, indeed, That young lady had little apprehension that the poor woman would have been weak enough to let any of her daughters wear it in that form. Molly was charmed with the first opportunity she ever had of showing her beauty to advantage, for though she could very well bear to contemplate herself in the glass, even when dressed in rags, and though she had in that dress conquered the heart of Jones and perhaps of some others, yet she thought the addition of finery would much improve her charms and extend her conquests. Molly, therefore, having dressed herself out in this sack, with a new laced cap and some other ornaments which Tom had given her, repairs to church with her fan in her hand the very next Sunday. The great are deceived if they imagine they have appropriated ambition and vanity to themselves. These noble qualities flourish as notably in a country church and churchyard as in the drawing-room or in the closet. Schemes have indeed been laid in the vestry, which would hardly disgrace the conclave. Here is a ministry, and here is an opposition. Here are plots and circumventions, parties and factions, equal to those which are to be found in courts. Nor are the women here less practiced in the highest feminine arts than their fair superiors in quality and fortune. Here are prudes and coquettes. Here are dressing and ogling, falsehood, envy, malice, scandal. In short, everything which is common to the most splendid assembly or politest circle. Let those of high life, therefore, no longer despise the ignorance of their inferiors, nor the vulgar any longer rail at the vices of their betters. Molly had seated herself some time before she was known by her neighbors. And then a whisper ran through the whole congregation. "Who is she?" But when she was discovered, such sneering, jiggling, tittering, and laughing ensued among the women that Mr. Allworthy was obliged to exert his authority to preserve any decency among them. Chapter 8. A battle sung by the Muse in the Homerican style, and which none but the classical reader can taste. Mr. Western had an estate in this parish, and as his house stood at little greater distance from this church than from his own, he very often came to divine service here, and both he and the charming Sophia happened to be present at this time. Sophia was much pleased with the beauty of the girl, whom she pitied for her simplicity in having dressed herself in that manner, as she saw the envy which it had occasioned among her equals. She no sooner came home than she sent for the gamekeeper, and ordered him to bring his daughter to her, saying she would provide for her in the family, and might possibly place the girl about her own person, when her own maid, who was now going away, had left her. Poor Seagrim was thunderstruck at this, for he was no stranger to the fault in the shape of his daughter. He answered in a stammering voice that he was afraid Molly would be too awkward to wait on her ladyship, as she had never been at service. "No matter for that," says Sophia, "she will soon improve. I am pleased with the girl, and am resolved to try her." Black George now repaired to his wife, on whose prudent counsel he depended to extricate him out of this dilemma, but when he came thither he found his house in some confusion. So great envy had this sack occasioned, that when Mr. Allworthy and the other gentry were gone from church, the rage, which had hitherto been confined, burst into an uproar, and having vented itself at first in opprobrious words, laughs, hisses, and gestures, betook itself at last to certain missile weapons, which, though from their plastic nature they threatened neither the loss of life or of limb, were however sufficiently dreadful to a well-dressed lady. Molly had too much spirit to bear this treatment tamely. Having therefore but hold, as we are diffident of our own abilities, let us here invite a superior power to our assistance. Ye muses, then, whoever ye are, who love to sing battles, and principally thou who whilom didst recount the slaughter in those fields where Hudibras and Trulla fought, if thou wert not starved with thy friend Butler, assist me on this great occasion. All things are not in the power of all. As a vast herd of cows in a rich farmer's yard, if, while they are milked, they hear their calves at a distance, lamenting the robbery which is then committing, roar and bellow. So roared forth the Somersetshire mob in Hallelujah, made up of almost as many squalls, screams, and other different sounds as there were persons, or indeed passions among them. Some were inspired by rage, others alarmed by fear, and others had nothing in their heads but the love of fun. But chiefly envy, the sister of Satan, and his constant companion, rushed among the crowd, and blew up the fury of the women, who no sooner came up to Molly than they pelted her with dirt and rubbish. Molly, having endeavored in vain to make a handsome retreat, faced about, and laying hold of Ragged Bess, who advanced in the front of the enemy, she at one blow felled her to the ground. The whole army of the enemy, though near 100 in number, seeing the fate of their general, gave back many paces and retired behind a new-dug grave, for the churchyard was the field of battle, where there was to be a funeral that very evening. Molly pursued her victory, and catching up a skull which lay on the side of the grave, discharged it with such fury, that having hit a tailor on the head, the two skulls sent equally forth a hollow sound at their meeting, and the tailor took presently measure of his length on the ground, where the skulls lay side by side, and it was doubtful which was the more valuable of the two. Molly, then taking a thigh bone in her hand, fell in among the flying ranks, and dealing her blows with great liberality on either side, overthrew the carcass of many a mighty hero and heroine. Recount, O Muse, the names of those who fell on this fatal day. First, Jimmy Tweedle felt on his hinder head the direful bone. Him the pleasant banks of sweetly winding Stour had nourished, where he first learnt the vocal art, with which, wandering up and down at wakes and fairs, he cheered the rural nymphs and swains, when upon the green they interweaved the sprightly dance, while he himself stood fiddling and jumping to his own music. How little now avails his fiddle. He thumps the verdant floor with his carcass. Next, old Etchapole, the Sogulder, received a blow in his forehead from our Amazonian heroine, and immediately fell to the ground. He was a swinging fat fellow, and fell with almost as much noise as a house. His tobacco box dropped at the same time from his pocket, which Molly took up as lawful spoils. Then Kate of the Mill tumbled unfortunately over a tombstone, which, catching hold of her ungartered stocking, inverted the order of nature, and gave her heels the superiority to her head. Betty Pippin, with young Roger her lover, fell both to the ground, where, O perverse fate! She salutes the earth, and he the sky. Tom Freckle, the smith's son, was the next victim to her rage. He was an ingenious workman, and made excellent patens. Nay, the very paten with which he was knocked down was his own workmanship. Had he been at that time singing psalms in the church, he would have avoided a broken head. Miss Crow, the daughter of a farmer, John Giddish, himself a farmer, Nan Slouch, Esther Codling, Will Spray, Tom Bennett, the three Mrs. Potter, whose father keeps the sign of the Red Lion, Betty Chambermaid, Jack Ostler, and many others of inferior note, lay rolling among the graves. Not that the strenuous arm of Molly reached all these, for many of them in their flight overthrew each other. But now Fortune, fearing she had acted out of character, and had inclined too long to the same side, especially as it was the right side, hastily turned about. For now Goody Brown, whom Zekiel Brown caressed in his arms, nor he alone, but half the parish besides, so famous was she in the fields of Venus, nor indeed less in those of Mars. The trophies of both these her husband always bore about on his head and face, for if ever human head did by its horns display the amorous glories of a wife, Zekiel's did. Nor did his well-scratched face less denote her talents, or rather talons, of a different kind. No longer bore this Amazon the shameful flight of her party. She stopped short, and, calling aloud to all who fled, spoke as follows. Ye Somersetshire men, or rather ye Somersetshire women, are ye not ashamed thus to fly from a single woman? But if no other will oppose her, I myself and Joan Top here will have the honor of the victory. Having thus said, she flew at Molly Seagrim, and easily wrenched the thigh bone from her hand, at the same time clawing off her cap from her head. Then laying hold of the hair of Molly with her left hand, she attacked her so furiously in the face with the right, that the blood soon began to trickle from her nose. Molly was not idle this while. She soon removed the clout from the head of Goody Brown, and then fastening on her hair with one hand, with the other she caused another bloody stream to issue forth from the nostrils of the enemy. When each of the combatants had borne off sufficient spoils of hair from the head of her antagonist, the next rage was against the garments. In this attack they exerted so much violence that in a very few minutes they were both naked to the middle. It is lucky for the women that the seat of fisticuff war is not the same with them as among men. But though they may seem a little to deviate from their sex, when they go forth to battle, yet I have observed they never so far forget as to assail the bosoms of each other, where a few blows would be fatal to most of them. This, I know, some derive from their being of a more bloody inclination than the males, on which account they apply to the nose, as to the part whence blood may most easily be drawn, but this seems a far-fetched as well as ill-natured supposition. Goody Brown had great advantage of Molly in this particular, for the former had indeed no breasts, her bosom, if it may be so called, as well in color as in many other properties, exactly resembling an antient piece of parchment, upon which anyone might have drummed a considerable while without doing her any great damage. Molly, beside her present unhappy condition, was differently formed in those parts, and might, perhaps, have tempted the envy of Brown to give her a fatal blow, had not the lucky arrival of Tom Jones at this instant put an immediate end to the bloody scene. This accident was luckily owing to Mr. Square, for he, Master Blifil, and Jones had mounted their horses after church to take the air, and had ridden about a quarter of a mile, when Square, changing his mind, not idly, but for a reason which we shall unfold as soon as we have leisure, desired the young gentleman to ride with him another way than they had at first purposed. This motion being complied with, brought them of necessity back again to the churchyard. Master Blifil, who rode first, seeing such a mob assembled, and two women in the posture in which we left the combatants, stopped his horse to inquire what was the matter. A country fellow, scratching his head, answered him, "I don't know, meester, I. An't please your honor, here hath been a fight, I think, between Goody Brown and Moll Seagrim." Who? Cries Tom, but without waiting for an answer, having discovered the features of his Molly through all the discomposure in which they now were, he hastily alighted, turned his horse loose, and leaping over the wall, ran to her. She now first, bursting into tears, told him how barbarously she had been treated. Upon which, forgetting the sex of Goody Brown, or perhaps not knowing it in his rage for, in reality, she had no feminine appearance but a petticoat, which he might not observe, he gave her a lash or two with his horsewhip. And then flying at the mob, who were all accused by Moll, he dealt his blows so profusely on all sides, that unless I would again invoke the muse, which the good-natured reader may think a little too hard upon her, as she hath so lately been violently sweated, it would be impossible for me to recount the horse-whipping of that day. Having scoured the whole coast of the enemy, as well as any of Homer's heroes ever did, or as Don Quixote or any knight-errant in the world could have done, he returned to Molly, whom he found in a condition which must give both me and my reader pain, was it to be described here. Tom raved like a madman, beat his breast, tore his hair, stamped on the ground, and vowed the utmost vengeance on all who had been concerned. He then pulled off his coat and buttoned it round her, put his hat upon her head, wiped the blood from her face as well as he could with his handkerchief, and called out to the servant to ride as fast as possible for a side saddle or a pillion, that he might carry her safe home. Master Blifil objected to the sending away the servant, as they had only one with them, but as Square seconded the order of Jones, he was obliged to comply. The servant returned in a very short time with the pillion, and Molly, having collected her rags as well as she could, was placed behind him. In which manner she was carried home, Square, Blifil, and Jones attending. Here Jones, having received his coat, given her a sly kiss and whispered her that he would return in the evening, quitted his Molly, and rode on after his companions. Chapter 9. Containing matter of no very peaceable color. Molly had no sooner apparelled herself in her accustomed rags than her sisters began to fall violently upon her, particularly her eldest sister, who told her she was well enough served. How had she the assurance to wear a gown, which young Madam Western had given to mother? "If one of us was to wear it, I think," says she, "I myself have the best right, but I warrant you think it belongs to your beauty. I suppose you think yourself more handsomer than any of us. Hand her down the bit of glass from over the cupboard," cries another. "I'd wash the blood from my face before I talked of my beauty. You'd better have minded what the parson says," cries the eldest, and not a hearkened after men voke. Indeed, child, and so she had, says the mother, sobbing. She hath brought a disgrace upon us all. She's the verst of the vaimily that ever was a whore. You need not upbraid me with that, mother, cries Molly. You yourself was brought to bed of sister there within a week after you was married. Yes, hussy, answered the enraged mother, so I was, and what was the mighty matter of that? I was made an honest woman then, and if you was to be made an honest woman, I should not be angry. But you must have to doing with a gentleman, you nasty slut. You will have a bastard, hussy, you will, and that I defy anyone to say of me. In this situation, Black George found his family when he came home for the purpose before mentioned. As his wife and 3 daughters were all of them talking together, and most of them crying, it was some time before he could get an opportunity of being heard. But as soon as such an interval occurred, he acquainted the company with what Sophia had said to him. Goody Seagrim then began to revile her daughter afresh. Here, says she, you have brought us into a fine quandary indeed. What will madam say to that big belly? Oh, that ever I should live to see this day, Molly answered with great spirit. And what is this mighty place which you have got for me, father? For he had not well understood the phrase used by Sophia of being about her person. I suppose it is to be under the cook, but I shan't wash dishes for anybody. My gentleman will provide better for me. See what he hath given me this afternoon. He hath promised I shall never want money, and you shan't want money neither, mother, if you will hold your tongue and know when you are well. And so saying, she pulled out several guineas and gave her mother one of them. The good woman no sooner felt the gold within her palm than her temper began, such is the efficacy of that panacea, to be mollified. Why, husband, says she, would any but such a blockhead as you not have inquired what place this was before he had accepted it? Perhaps, as Molly says, it may be in the kitchen, and truly I don't care my daughter should be a scullion wench, for poor as I am a gentlewoman. And thof I was obliged, as my father, who was a clergyman, died worse than nothing, and so could not give me a shilling of potion, to undervalue myself by marrying a poor man. Yet I would have you to know, I have a spirit above all them things. Mary, come up. It would better become Madam Western to look at home, and remember who her own grandfather was. Some of my family, for aught I know, might ride in their coaches, when the grandfathers of some voke walked avoot. I warrant she fancies she did a mighty matter, when she sent us that old gownd. Some of my family would not have picked up such rags in the street, but poor people are always trampled upon. The parish need not have been in such a fluster with Molly. You might have told them, child, your grandmother wore better things new out of the shop. Well, but consider, cried George, what answer shall I make to madam? I don't know what answer, says she. You are always bringing your family into one quandary or other. Do you remember when you shot the partridge, the occasion of all our misfortunes? Did not I advise you never to go into Squire Western's manor? Did not I tell you many a good year ago what would come of it? But you would have your own headstrong ways. Yes, you would, you villain. Black George was, in the main, a peaceable kind of fellow and nothing choleric nor rash. Yet did he bear about him something of what the Antients called the irascible, and which his wife, if she had been endowed with much wisdom, would have feared. He had long experienced that when the storm grew very high, arguments were but wind, which served rather to increase than to abate it. He was therefore seldom unprovided with a small switch, a remedy of wonderful force, as he had often essayed, and which the word villain served as a hint for his applying. No sooner, therefore, had this symptom appeared, than he had immediate recourse to the said remedy, which though, as it is usual in all very efficacious medicines, it at first seemed to heighten and inflame the disease, soon produced a total calm, and restored the patient to perfect ease and tranquillity. This is, however, a kind of horse medicine, which requires a very robust constitution to digest, and is therefore proper only for the vulgar, unless in one single instance, viz., where superiority of birth breaks out, in which case we should not think it very improperly applied by any husband whatever, if the application was not in itself so base, that, like certain applications of the physical kind which need not be mentioned. It so much degrades and contaminates the hand employed in it, that no gentleman should endure the thought of anything so low and detestable. The whole family were soon reduced to a state of perfect quiet, for the virtue of this medicine, like that of electricity, is often communicated through one person to many others, who are not touched by the instrument. To say the truth, as they both operate by friction, it may be doubted whether there is not something analogous between them, of which Mr. Freak would do well to inquire before he publishes the next edition of his book. A council was now called, in which, after many debates, Molly still persisting that she would not go to service, it was at length resolved that Goody Seagrim herself should wait on Miss Western, and endeavor to procure the place for her eldest daughter, who declared great readiness to accept it. But Fortune, who seems to have been an enemy of this little family, afterwards put a stop to her promotion. Chapter 10. A story told by Mr. Supple, the curate. The penetration of Squire Western. His great love for his daughter, and the return to it made by her. The next morning Tom Jones hunted with Mr. Western, and was at his return invited by that gentleman to dinner. The lovely Sophia shone forth that day, with more gaiety and sprightliness than usual. Her battery was certainly levelled at our hero, though I believe she herself scarce yet knew her own intention, but if she had any design of charming him, she now succeeded. Mr. Supple, the curate of Mr. Allworthy's parish, made one of the company. He was a good-natured, worthy man, but chiefly remarkable for his great taciturnity at table, though his mouth was never shut at it. In short, he had one of the best appetites in the world. However, the cloth was no sooner taken away than he always made sufficient amends for his silence, for he was a very hearty fellow, and his conversation was often entertaining, never offensive. At his first arrival, which was immediately before the entrance of the roast beef, he had given an intimation that he had brought some news with him, and was beginning to tell that he came that moment from Mr. Allworthy's, when the sight of the roast beef struck him dumb, permitting him only to say grace, and to declare he must pay his respect to the baronet, for so he called the sirloin. When dinner was over, being reminded by Sophia of his news, he began as follows. "I believe, lady, your ladyship observed a young woman at church yesterday at evensong, who was dressed in one of your outlandish garments. I think I have seen your ladyship in such a one. However, in the country, such dresses are rara avis in terris, nigroque similima signo. That is, madam, as much as to say, a rare bird upon the earth and very like a black swan." The verse is in Juvenal. But to return to what I was relating. I was saying such garments are rare sights in the country, and perchance, too, it was thought the more rare, respect being had to the person who wore it, who, they tell me, is the daughter of Black George, your worship's gamekeeper, whose sufferings, I should have opined, might have taught him more wit than to dress forth his wenches in such gaudy apparel. She created so much confusion in the congregation that if Squire Allworthy had not silenced it, it would have interrupted the service, for I was once about to stop in the middle of the first lesson. Howbeit, nevertheless, after prayer was over, and I was departed home, this occasioned a battle in the churchyard, where, amongst other mischief, the head of a travelling fiddler was very much broken. This morning, the fiddler came to Squire Allworthy for a warrant, and the wench was brought before him. The squire was inclined to have compounded matters, when, lo! On a sudden the wench appeared. I ask your ladyship's pardon to be, as it were, at the eve of bringing forth a bastard. The squire demanded of her who was the father, but she pertinaciously refused to make any response, so that he was about to make her mittimus to Bridewell when I departed. "And is a wench having a bastard all your news, doctor?" cries Western. "I thought it might have been some public matter, something about the nation." "I am afraid it is too common indeed," answered the parson, "but I thought the whole story altogether deserved commemorating. As to national matters, your worship knows them best. My concerns extend no farther than my own parish." "Why, aye," says the squire, "I believe I do know a little of that matter, as you say. But come, Tommy, drink about, the bottle stands with you." Tom begged to be excused, for that he had particular business, and getting up from table, escaped the clutches of the squire, who was rising to stop him, and went off with very little ceremony. The squire gave him a good curse at his departure, and then turning to the parson, he cried out, "I smoke it! I smoke it! Tom is certainly the father of this bastard. Zooks, parson, you remember how he recommended the veither her to me. Dn what a sly bch 'tis. I, as sure as 2 pence, Tom is the veither of the bastard. I should be very sorry for that," says the parson. "Why sorry?" cries the squire. "Where is the mighty matter? What, I suppose, dost pretend that thee hast never got a bastard? Pox, more good luck's thine. For I warrant hast a done therefore many's the good time and often." "Your worship is pleased to be jocular," answered the parson. "But I do not only animadvert on the sinfulness of the action, though that surely is to be greatly deprecated, but I fear his unrighteousness may injure him with Mr. Allworthy. And truly I must say, though he hath the character of being a little wild, I never saw any harm in the young man, nor can I say I have heard any, save what your worship now mentions. I wish, indeed, he was a little more regular in his responses at church, but altogether he seems ingenui vultus puer ingenuique pudoris. That is a classical line, young lady, and being rendered into English is a lad of an ingenuous countenance and of an ingenuous modesty, for this was a virtue in great repute both among the Latins and Greeks. I must say the young gentleman, for so I think I may call him, notwithstanding his birth, appears to me a very modest, civil lad, and I should be sorry that he should do himself any injury in Squire Allworthy's opinion." "Poog," says the squire, "injury with Allworthy? Why, Allworthy loves a wench himself. Doth not all the country know whose son Tom is? You must talk to another person in that manner. I remember Allworthy at college. I thought," said the parson, "he had never been at the university." Yes, he was," says the squire, "and many a wench have we two had together. As errant a whoremaster as any within 5 miles one. No, it will don no harm with he, assure yourself, nor with anybody else. Ask Sophie, there you have not the worse opinion of a young fellow for getting a bastard. Have you, girl? No, the women will like on the better for't." This was a cruel question to poor Sophia. She had observed Tom's color change at the parson's story, and that, with his hasty and abrupt departure, gave her sufficient reason to think her father's suspicion not groundless. Her heart now at once discovered the great secret to her which it had been so long disclosing by little and little, and she found herself highly interested in this matter. In such a situation, her father's malapert question rushing suddenly upon her produced some symptoms which might have alarmed a suspicious heart. But to do the squire justice, that was not his fault. When she rose, therefore, from her chair, and told him a hint from him was always sufficient to make her withdraw, he suffered her to leave the room, and then with great gravity of countenance remarked that it was better to see a daughter over-modest than over-forward, a sentiment which was highly applauded by the parson. There now ensued between the squire and the parson a most excellent political discourse, framed out of newspapers and political pamphlets, in which they made a libation of 4 bottles of wine to the good of their country. And then, the squire being fast asleep, the parson lighted his pipe, mounted his horse, and rode home. When the squire had finished his half-hour's nap, he summoned his daughter to her harpsichord, but she begged to be excused that evening, on account of a violent headache. This remission was presently granted, for indeed she seldom had occasion to ask him twice, as he loved her with such ardent affection, that, by gratifying her, he commonly conveyed the highest gratification to himself. She was really, what he frequently called her, his little darling, and she well deserved to be so, for she returned all his affection in the most ample manner. She had preserved the most inviolable duty to him in all things, and this her love made not only easy, but so delightful, that when one of her companions laughed at her for placing so much merit in such scrupulous obedience, as that young lady called it, Sophia answered, "You mistake me, madam, if you think I value myself upon this account, for besides that I am barely discharging my duty, I am likewise pleasing myself. I can truly say I have no delight equal to that of contributing to my Father's happiness. And if I value myself, my dear, it is on having this power, and not on executing it. This was a satisfaction, however, which poor Sophia was incapable of tasting this evening. She therefore not only desired to be excused from her attendance at the harpsichord, but likewise begged that he would suffer her to absent herself from supper. To this request likewise the squire agreed, though not without some reluctance, for he scarce ever permitted her to be out of his sight, unless when he was engaged with his horses, dogs, or bottle. Nevertheless, he yielded to the desire of his daughter, though the poor man was at the same time obliged to avoid his own company, if I may so express myself, by sending for a neighboring farmer to sit with him. Chapter 11. The narrow escape of Molly Seagram, with some observations for which we have been forced to dive pretty deep into nature. Tom Jones had ridden one of Mr. Western's horses that morning in the chase, so that having no horse of his own in the squire's stable, he was obliged to go home on foot. This he did so expeditiously that he ran upwards of 3 miles within the half-hour. Just as he arrived at Mr. Allworthy's outward gate, he met the constable and company with Molly in their possession, whom they were conducting to that house, where the inferior sort of people may learn one good lesson, viz., respect and deference to their superiors, since it must show them the wide distinction fortune intends between those persons who are to be corrected for their faults and those who are not. Which lesson if they do not learn, I am afraid they very rarely learn any other good lesson, or improve their morals at the house of correction. A lawyer may perhaps think Mr. Allworthy exceeded his authority a little in this instance. And to say the truth, I question, as here was no regular information before him, whether his conduct was strictly regular. However, as his intention was truly upright, he ought to be excused in foro conscientiae, since so many arbitrary acts are daily committed by magistrates who have not this excuse to plead for themselves. Tom was no sooner informed by the constable whither they were proceeding, indeed he pretty well guessed it of himself, than he caught Molly in his arms, and embracing her tenderly before them all, swore he would murder the first man who offered to lay hold of her. He bid her dry her eyes and be comforted, for wherever she went, he would accompany her. Then turning to the constable, who stood trembling with his hat off, he desired him, in a very mild voice, to return with him for a moment only to his father, for so he now called Allworthy. For he durst, he said, be assured that, when he had alleged what he had to say in her favor, the girl would be discharged. The constable, who, I make no doubt, would have surrendered his prisoner had Tom demanded her, very readily consented to this request. So back they all went into Mr. Allworthy's hall, where Tom desired them to stay till his return, and then went himself in pursuit of the good man. As soon as he was found, Tom threw himself at his feet, and having begged a patient hearing, confessed himself to be the father of the child of which Molly was then big. He entreated him to have compassion on the poor girl, and to consider, if there was any guilt in the case, it lay principally at his door. If there is any guilt in the case, answered Allworthy warmly, are you then so profligate and abandoned a libertine to doubt whether the breaking the laws of God and man, the corrupting and ruining a poor girl be guilt? I own, indeed, it doth lie principally upon you, and so heavy it is that you ought to expect it should crush you. Whatever may be my fate, says Tom, let me succeed in my intercessions for the poor girl. I confess I have corrupted her, but whether she shall be ruined depends on you. For heaven's sake, sir, revoke your warrant, and do not send her to a place which must unavoidably prove her destruction. Allworthy bid him immediately call a servant. Tom answered there was no occasion, for he had luckily met them at the gate, and relying upon his goodness, had brought them all back into his hall, where they now waited his final resolution, which upon his knees he besought him might be in favor of the girl, that she might be permitted to go home to her parents, and not be exposed to a greater degree of shame and scorn than must necessarily fall upon her. I know, said he, that is too much. I know I am the wicked occasion of it. I will endeavor to make amends if possible, and if you shall have hereafter the goodness to forgive me, I hope I shall deserve it." Allworthy hesitated some time, and at last said, "Well, I will discharge my mittimus. You may send the constable to me." He was instantly called, discharged, and so was the girl. It will be believed that Mr. Allworthy failed not to read Tom a very severe lecture on this occasion, but it is unnecessary to insert it here, as we have faithfully transcribed what he said to Jenny Jones in the first book, most of which may be applied to the men, equally with the women. So sensible an effect had these reproofs on the young man, who was no hardened sinner, that he retired to his own room, where he passed the evening alone, in much melancholy contemplation. Allworthy was sufficiently offended by this transgression of Jones, for notwithstanding the assertions of Mr. Western, it is certain this worthy man had never indulged himself in any loose pleasures with women, and greatly condemned the vice of incontinence in others. Indeed, there is much reason to imagine that there was not the least truth in what Mr. Western affirmed, especially as he laid the scene of those impurities at the university, where Mr. Allworthy had never been. In fact, the good squire was a little too apt to indulge that kind of pleasantry which is generally called rhodomontade, but which may, with as much propriety, be expressed by a much shorter word. And perhaps we too often supply the use of this little monosyllable by others, since very much of what frequently passes in the world for wit and humor should, in the strictest purity of language, receive that short appellation, which, in conformity to the well-bred laws of custom, I here suppress. But whatever detestation Mr. Allworthy had to this, or to any other vice, he was not so blinded by it, but that he could discern any virtue in the guilty person, as clearly indeed as if there had been no mixture of vice in the same character. While he was angry, therefore, with the incontinence of Jones, he was no less pleased with the honor and honesty of his self-accusation. He began now to form in his mind the same opinion of this young fellow, which, we hope, our reader may have conceived. And in balancing his faults with his perfections, the latter seemed rather to preponderate. It was to no purpose, therefore, that Thwackum, who was immediately charged by Mr. Blifil with the story, unbended all his rancor against poor Tom. Allworthy gave a patient hearing to their invectives, and then answered coldly, that young men of Tom's complexion were too generally addicted to this vice, but he believed that youth was sincerely affected with what he had said to him on the occasion, and he hoped he would not transgress again. So that, as the days of whipping were at an end, the tutor had no other vent but his own mouth for his gall, the usual poor resource of impotent revenge. But Square, who was a less violent, was a much more artful man, and as he hated Jones more perhaps than Thwackum himself did, so he contrived to do him more mischief in the mind of Mr. Allworthy. The reader must remember the several little incidents of the partridge, the horse, and the Bible, which were recounted in the second book. By all which Jones had rather improved than injured the affection which Mr. Allworthy was inclined to entertain for him. The same, I believe, must have happened to him with every other person who hath any idea of friendship, generosity, and greatness of spirit, that is to say, who hath any traces of goodness in his mind. Square himself was not unacquainted with the true impression which those several instances of goodness had made on the excellent heart of Allworthy, for the philosopher very well knew what virtue was, though he was not always perhaps steady in its pursuit. But as for Thwackum, from what reason I will not determine, no such thoughts ever entered into his head. He saw Jones in a bad light, and he imagined Allworthy saw him in the same, but that he was resolved, from pride and stubbornness of spirit, not to give up the boy whom he had once cherished, since by so doing he must tacitly acknowledge that his former opinion of him had been wrong. Square therefore embraced this opportunity of injuring Jones in the tenderest part, by giving a very bad turn to all these before-mentioned occurrences. I am sorry, sir, said he, to own I have been deceived as well as yourself. I could not, I confess, help being pleased with what I ascribed to the motive of friendship, though it was carried to an excess, and all excess is faulty and vicious. But in this I made allowance for youth. Little did I suspect that the sacrifice of truth, which we both imagined to have been made to friendship, was in reality a prostitution of it to a depraved and debauched appetite. You now plainly see whence all the seeming generosity of this young man to the family of the gamekeeper proceeded. He supported the father in order to corrupt the daughter and preserve the family from starving, to bring one of them to shame and ruin. This is friendship, this is generosity. As Sir Richard Steele says, gluttons who give high prices for delicacies are very worthy to be called generous. In short, I am resolved, from this instance, never to give way to the weakness of human nature more, nor to think anything virtue which doth not exactly quadrate with the unerring rule of right. The goodness of Allworthy had prevented those considerations from occurring to himself, yet were they too plausible to be absolutely and hastily rejected when laid before his eyes by another. Indeed, what Square had said sunk very deeply into his mind, and the uneasiness which it there created was very visible to the other, though the good man would not acknowledge this, but made a very slight answer, and forcibly drove off the discourse to some other subject. It was well perhaps for poor Tom that no such suggestions had been made before he was pardoned, for they certainly stamped in the mind of Allworthy the first bad impression concerning Jones. Chapter 12. Containing much clearer matters, but which flowed from the same fountain with those in the preceding chapter. The reader will be pleased, I believe, to return with me to Sophia. She passed the night, after we saw her last, in no very agreeable manner. Sleep befriended her but little, and dreams less. In the morning, when Mrs. Honor, her maid, attended her at the usual hour, she was found already up and dressed. Persons who live 2 or 3 miles distance in the country are considered as next-door neighbors, and transactions at the one house fly with incredible celerity to the other. Mrs. Honor, therefore, had heard the whole story of Molly's shame, which she, being of a very communicative temper, had no sooner entered the apartment of her mistress than she began to relate in the following manner. "La, ma'am, what doth your Lawship think? The girl that your Lawship saw at church on Sunday, whom you thought so handsome, though you would not have thought her so handsome neither, if you had seen her nearer, but to be sure she hath been carried before the justice for being big with child. She seemed to me to look like a confident slut, and to be sure she hath laid the child to young Mr. Jones. And all the parish says Mr. Allworthy is so angry with young Mr. Jones that he won't see him. To be sure, one can't help pitying the poor young man, and yet he doth not deserve much pity neither, for demeaning himself with such kind of trumpery. Yet he is so pretty a gentleman, I should be sorry to have him turned out of doors. I dares to swear the wench was as willing as he, for she was always a forward kind of body. And when wenches are so coming, young men are not so much to be blamed neither, for to be sure they do know more than what is natural. Indeed, it is beneath them to meddle with such dirty draggle-tails, and whatever happens to them, it is good enough for them. And yet, to be sure, the vile baggages are most in fault. I wishes, with all my heart, they were well to be whipped at the cart's tail, for it is pity they should be the ruin of a pretty young gentleman, and nobody can deny but that Mr. Jones is one of the most handsomest young men that ever. She was running on thus, when Sophia, with a more peevish voice than she had ever spoken to her in before, cried, "Prithee, why dost thou trouble me with all this stuff? What concern have I in what Mr. Jones doth? I suppose you are all alike. And you seem to me to be angry it was not your own case." "Ay, ma'am," answered Mrs. Honor, "I am sorry your ladyship should have such an opinion of me. I am sure nobody can say any such thing of me. All the young fellows in the world may go to the divil for me, because I said he was a handsome man. Everybody says it as well as I. To be sure, I never thought as it was any harm to say a young man was handsome, but to be sure I shall never think him so any more now, for handsome is that handsome does." "A beggar wench! Stop thy torrent of impertinence," cries Sophia, "and see whether my father wants me at breakfast." Mrs. Honor then flung out of the room, muttering much to herself, of which "Mary come up, I assure you," was all that could be plainly distinguished. Whether Mrs. Honor really deserved that suspicion, of which her mistress gave her a hint, is a matter which we cannot indulge our readers' curiosity by resolving. We will, however, make him amends in disclosing what passed in the mind of Sophia. The reader will be pleased to recollect that a secret affection for Mr. Jones had insensibly stolen into the bosom of this young lady, that it had there grown to a pretty great height before she herself had discovered it. When she first began to perceive its symptoms, the sensations were so sweet and pleasing that she had not resolution sufficient to check or repel them, and thus she went on cherishing a passion of which she never once considered the consequences. This incident relating to Molly first opened her eyes. She now first perceived the weakness of which she had been guilty, and though it caused the utmost perturbation in her mind, yet it had the effect of other nauseous physic, and for the time expelled her distemper. Its operation, indeed, was most wonderfully quick, and in the short interval, while her maid was absent, so entirely removed all symptoms, that when Mrs. Honor returned with a summons from her father, she was become perfectly easy, and had brought herself to a thorough indifference for Mr. Jones. The diseases of the mind do, in almost every particular, imitate those of the body. For which reason, we hope that learned faculty, for whom we have so profound a respect, will pardon us the violent hands we have been necessitated to lay on several words and phrases, which of right belong to them, and without which our descriptions must have been often unintelligible. Now there is no one circumstance in which the distempers of the mind bear a more exact analogy to those which are called bodily, than that aptness which both have to a relapse. This is plain in the violent diseases of ambition and avarice. I have known ambition, when cured at court by frequent disappointments, which are the only physic for it, to break out again in a contest for foreman of the grand jury at an assizes, and have heard of a man who had so far conquered avarice as to give away many a sixpence, that comforted himself, at last, on his deathbed, by making a crafty and advantageous bargain concerning his ensuing funeral with an undertaker who had married his only child. In the affair of love, which, out of strict conformity with the Stoic philosophy, we shall here treat as a disease, this proneness to relapse is no less conspicuous. Thus it happened to poor Sophia, upon whom, the very next time she saw young Jones, all the former symptoms returned, and from that time cold and hot fits alternately seized her heart. The situation of this young lady was now very different from what it had ever been before. That passion which had formerly been so exquisitely delicious became now a scorpion in her bosom. She resisted it, therefore, with her utmost force, and summoned every argument her reason, which was surprisingly strong for her age, could suggest, to subdue and expel it. In this she so far succeeded, that she began to hope from time and absence a perfect cure. She resolved, therefore, to avoid Tom Jones as much as possible, for which purpose she began to conceive a design of visiting her aunt, to which she made no doubt of obtaining her father's consent. But fortune, who had other designs in her head, put an immediate stop to any such proceeding, by introducing an accident, which will be related in the next chapter. Chapter 13. A dreadful accident which befell Sophia. The gallant behavior of Jones, and the more dreadful consequence of that behavior to the young lady, with a short digression in favor of the female sex. Mr. Western grew every day fonder and fonder of Sophia, insomuch that his beloved dogs themselves almost gave place to her in his affections. But as he could not prevail on himself to abandon these, he contrived very cunningly to enjoy their company, together with that of his daughter, by insisting on her riding a hunting with him. Sophia, to whom her father's word was a law, readily complied with his desires, though she had not the least delight in a sport, which was of too rough and masculine a nature to suit with her disposition. She had, however, another motive, beside her obedience, to accompany the old gentleman in the chase, for by her presence she hoped in some measure to restrain his impetuosity, and to prevent him from so frequently exposing his neck to the utmost hazard. The strongest objection was that which would have formerly been an inducement to her, namely, the frequent meeting with young Jones, whom she had determined to avoid. But as the end of the hunting season now approached, she hoped, by a short absence with her aunt, to reason herself entirely out of her unfortunate passion, and had not any doubt of being able to meet him in the field the subsequent season without the least danger. On the second day of her hunting, as she was returning from the chase, and was arrived within a little distance from Mr. Western's house, her horse, whose mettlesome spirit required a better rider, fell suddenly to prancing and capering in such a manner that she was in the most imminent peril of falling. Tom Jones, who was at a little distance behind, saw this and immediately galloped up to her assistance. As soon as he came up, he leapt from his own horse and caught hold of hers by the bridle. The unruly beast presently reared himself an end on his hind legs and threw his lovely burthen from his back, and Jones caught her in his arms. She was so affected with the fright that she was not immediately able to satisfy Jones, who was very solicitous to know whether she had received any hurt. She soon after, however, recovered her spirits, assured him she was safe, and thanked him for the care he had taken of her. Jones answered, "If I have preserved you, madam, I am sufficiently repaid, for I promise you I would have secured you from the least harm at the expense of a much greater misfortune to myself than I have suffered on this occasion." "What misfortune?" replied Sophia eagerly. "I hope you have come to no mischief." "Be not concerned, madam," answered Jones. "Heaven be praised you have escaped so well, considering the danger you was in. If I have broke my arm, I consider it as a trifle, in comparison of what I feared upon your account." Sophia then screamed out, "Broke your arm?" "Heaven forbid. I am afraid I have, madam," says Jones, "but I beg you will suffer me first to take care of you. I have a right hand yet at your service, to help you into the next field, whence we have but a very little walk to your father's house." Sophia, seeing his left arm dangling by his side, while he was using the other to lead her, no longer doubted of the truth. She now grew much paler than her fears for herself had made her before. All her limbs were seized with a trembling, insomuch that Jones could scarce support her. And as her thoughts were in no less agitation, she could not refrain from giving Jones a look so full of tenderness that it almost argued a stronger sensation in her mind than even gratitude and pity united can raise in the gentlest female bosom, without the assistance of a third more powerful passion. Mr. Western, who was advanced at some distance when this accident happened, was now returned, as were the rest of the horsemen. Sophia immediately acquainted them with what had befallen Jones, and begged them to take care of him. Upon which Western, who had been much alarmed by meeting his daughter's horse without its rider, and was now overjoyed to find her unhurt, cried out, "I am glad it is no worse. If Tom hath broken his arm, we will get a joiner to mend un again." The squire alighted from his horse, and proceeded to his house on foot with his daughter and Jones. An impartial spectator, who had met them on the way, would, on viewing their several countenances, have concluded Sophia alone to have been the object of compassion. For as to Jones, he exulted in having probably saved the life of the young lady, at the price only of a broken bone. And Mr. Western, though he was not unconcerned at the accident which had befallen Jones, was, however, delighted in a much higher degree with the fortunate escape of his daughter. The generosity of Sophia's temper construed this behavior of Jones into great bravery, and it made a deep impression on her heart. For certain it is that there is no one quality which so generally recommends men to women as this, proceeding, if we believe the common opinion, from that natural timidity of the sex, which is, says Mr. Osborne, so great that a woman is the most cowardly of all the creatures God ever made. A sentiment more remarkable for its bluntness than for its truth. Aristotle, in his Politics, doth them, I believe, more justice, when he says, "The modesty and fortitude of men differ from those virtues in women, for the fortitude which becomes a woman would be cowardice in a man, and the modesty which becomes a man would be pertness in a woman." Nor is there, perhaps, more of truth in the opinion of those who derive the partiality which women are inclined to show to the brave, from this excess of their fear. Mr. Bayle, I think, in his article of Helen, imputes this, and with greater probability, to their violent love of glory. For the truth of which, we have the authority of him who of all others saw farthest into human nature, and who introduces the heroine of his Odyssey, the great pattern of matrimonial love and constancy, assigning the glory of her husband as the only source of her affection towards him. Asterisk, asterisk, the English reader will not find this in the poem, for the sentiment is entirely left out in the translation. However this be, certain it is that the accident operated very strongly on Sophia. And indeed, after much inquiry into the matter, I am inclined to believe that, at this very time, the charming Sophia made no less impression on the heart of Jones. To say truth, he had for some time become sensible of the irresistible power of her charms. Chapter 14. The arrival of a surgeon, his operations, and a long dialogue between Sophia and her maid. When they arrived at Mr. Western's hall, Sophia, who had tottered along with much difficulty, sunk down in her chair. But by the assistance of hartshorn and water, she was prevented from fainting away, and had pretty well recovered her spirits, when the surgeon who was sent for to Jones appeared. Mr. Western, who imputed these symptoms in his daughter to her fall, advised her to be presently blooded by way of prevention. In this opinion he was seconded by the surgeon, who gave so many reasons for bleeding, and quoted so many cases where persons had miscarried for want of it, that the squire became very importunate, and indeed insisted peremptorily that his daughter should be blooded. Sophia soon yielded to the commands of her father, though entirely contrary to her own inclinations, for she suspected, I believe, less danger from the fright than either the squire or the surgeon. She then stretched out her beautiful arm, and the operator began to prepare for his work. While the servants were busied in providing materials, the surgeon, who imputed the backwardness which had appeared in Sophia to her fears, began to comfort her with assurances that there was not the least danger. For no accident, he said, could ever happen in bleeding, but from the monstrous ignorance of pretenders to surgery, which he pretty plainly insinuated was not at present to be apprehended. Sophia declared she was not under the least apprehension, adding, "If you open an artery, I promise you I'll forgive you." "Will you?" cries Western. "D.N. me if I will. If he does thee the least mischief, D.N. me if I don't haw the heart's blood one out." The surgeon assented to bleed her upon these conditions, and then proceeded to his operation, which he performed with as much dexterity as he had promised, and with as much quickness, for he took but little blood from her, saying it was much safer to bleed again and again than to take away too much at once. Sophia, when her arm was bound up, retired, for she was not willing, nor was it, perhaps, strictly decent, to be present at the operation on Jones. Indeed, one objection which she had to bleeding, though she did not make it, was the delay which it would occasion to setting the broken bone. For Western, when Sophia was concerned, had no consideration but for her, and as for Jones himself, he sat like Patience on a monument smiling at grief. To say the truth, when he saw the blood springing from the lovely arm of Sophia, he scarce thought of what had happened to himself. The surgeon now ordered his patient to be stripped to his shirt, and then entirely baring the arm, he began to stretch and examine it, in such a manner that the tortures he put him to caused Jones to make several wry faces, which the surgeon observing greatly wondered at, crying, "What is the matter, sir? I am sure it is impossible I should hurt you." And then holding forth the broken arm, he began a long and very learned lecture of anatomy, in which simple and double fractures were most accurately considered, and the several ways in which Jones might have broken his arm were discussed, with proper annotations showing how many of these would have been better, and how many worse than the present case. Having at length finished his labored harangue, with which the audience, though it had greatly raised their attention and admiration, were not much edified, as they really understood not a single syllable of all he had said, he proceeded to business, which he was more expeditious in finishing than he had been in beginning. Jones was then ordered into a bed, which Mr. Western compelled him to accept at his own house, and sentence of water gruel was passed upon him. Among the good company which had attended in the hall during the bone-setting, Mrs. Honor was one, who being summoned to her mistress as soon as it was over, and asked by her how the young gentleman did, presently launched into extravagant praises on the magnanimity, as she called it, of his behavior, which, she said, was so charming in so pretty a creature. She then burst forth into much warmer encomiums on the beauty of his person, enumerating many particulars, and ending with the whiteness of his skin. This discourse had an effect on Sophia's countenance, which would not perhaps have escaped the observance of the sagacious waiting woman, had she once looked her mistress in the face, all the time she was speaking. But as a looking-glass, which was most commodiously placed opposite to her, gave her an opportunity of surveying those features, in which, of all others, she took most delight. So she had not once removed her eyes from that amiable object during her whole speech. Mrs. Honor was so entirely wrapped up in the subject on which she exercised her tongue, and the object before her eyes, that she gave her mistress time to conquer her confusion, which having done, she smiled on her maid and told her, she was certainly in love with this young fellow. "I in love, madam," answers she. "Upon my word, ma'am, I assure you, ma'am, upon my soul, ma'am, I am not." "Why, if you was," cries her mistress, "I see no reason that you should be ashamed of it, for he is certainly a pretty fellow." "Yes, ma'am," answered the other, "that he is the most handsomest man I ever saw in my life." "Yes, to be sure, that he is. And, as your ladyship says, I don't know why I should be ashamed of loving him, though he is my betters. To be sure, gentlefolks are but flesh and blood, no more than us servants. Besides, as for Mr. Jones, thof Squire Allworthy hath made a gentleman of him, he was not so good as myself by birth. For thof I am a poor body, I am an honest person's child, and my father and mother were married, which is more than some people can say, as high as they hold their heads. Marry, come up. I assure you, my dirty cousin, thof his skin be so white, and to be sure it is the most whitest that ever was seen, I am a Christian as well as he, and nobody can say that I am base born. My grandfather was a clergyman, and would have been very angry, I believe, to have thought any of his family should have taken up with Molly Seagram's dirty leavings. This is the second person of low condition whom we have recorded in this history to have sprung from the clergy. It is to be hoped such instances will, in future ages, when some provision is made for the families of the inferior clergy, appear stranger than they can be thought at present. Perhaps Sophia might have suffered her maid to run on in this manner, from wanting sufficient spirits to stop her tongue, which the reader may probably conjecture was no very easy task. For certainly there were some passages in her speech which were far from being agreeable to the lady. However, she now checked the torrent, as there seemed no end of its flowing. "I wonder," says she, "at your assurance in daring to talk thus of one of my father's friends. As to the wench, I order you never to mention her name to me. And with regard to the young gentleman's birth, those who can say nothing more to his disadvantage may as well be silent on that head, as I desire you will be for the future." "I am sorry I have offended your ladyship," answered Mrs. Honor. "I am sure I hate Molly Seagram as much as your ladyship can, and as for abusing Squire Jones, I can call all the servants in the house to witness, that whenever any talk hath been about bastards, I have always taken his part. For which of you, says I to the footman, would not be a bastard, if he could, to be made a gentleman of? And says I am sure he is a very fine gentleman, and he hath one of the whitest hands in the world, for to be sure so he hath. And, says I, one of the sweetest temperedest, best naturedest men in the world he is. And, says I, all the servants and neighbors all round the country loves him. And to be sure, I could tell your ladyship something, but that I am afraid it would offend you." "What could you tell me, Honor?" says Sophia. "Nay, ma'am, to be sure he meant nothing by it, therefore I would not have your ladyship be offended." "Prithee tell me," says Sophia. "I will know at this instant." "Why, ma'am," answered Mrs. Honor, "he came into the room one day last week when I was at work, and there lay your ladyship's muff on a chair, and to be sure he put his hands into it, that very muff your ladyship gave me but yesterday. La, says I, Mr. Jones, you will stretch my lady's muff and spoil it, but he still kept his hands in it, and then he kissed it. To be sure I hardly ever saw such a kiss in my life as he gave it." "I suppose he did not know it was mine," replied Sophia. "Your ladyship shall hear, ma'am. He kissed it again and again, and said it was the prettiest muff in the world." "La, sir," says I, "you have seen it 100 times." "Yes, Mrs. Honor," cried he, "but who can see anything beautiful in the presence of your lady but herself? Nay, that's not all neither. But I hope your ladyship won't be offended, for to be sure he meant nothing." One day, as your ladyship was playing on the harpsichord to my master, Mr. Jones was sitting in the next room, and methought he looked melancholy. La, says I, Mr. Jones, what's the matter? A penny for your thoughts, says I. Why, hussy, says he, starting up from a dream, what can I be thinking of when that angel your mistress is playing? And then squeezing me by the hand, oh. Mrs. Honor, says he, how happy will that man be? And then he sighed. Upon my troth, his breath is as sweet as a nosegay, but to be sure he meant no harm by it. So I hope your ladyship will not mention a word, for he gave me a crown never to mention it, and made me swear upon a book, but I believe, indeed, it was not the Bible. Till something of a more beautiful red than vermilion be found out, I shall say nothing of Sophia's color on this occasion. Honor, says she, if you will not mention this any more to me nor to anybody else, I will not betray you, I will not be angry, but I am afraid of your tongue. Why, my girl, will you give it such liberties? Nay, ma'am, answered she, to be sure, I would sooner cut out my tongue than offend your ladyship. To be sure, I shall never mention a word that your ladyship would not have me. Why, I would not have you mention this any more, said Sophia, for it may come to my father's ears, and he would be angry with Mr. Jones, though I really believe, as you say, he meant nothing. I should be very angry myself if I imagined. Nay, ma'am, says Honor, I protest I believe he meant nothing. I thought he talked as if he was out of his senses. Nay, he said he believed he was beside himself when he had spoken the words. Aye, sir, says I believe so too. Yes, says he, Honor, but I ask your ladyship's pardon. I could tear my tongue out for offending you. Go on, says Sophia. You may mention anything you have not told me before. Yes, Honor, says he, this was some time afterwards when he gave me the crown. I am neither such a coxcomb or such a villain as to think of her in any other delight but as my goddess. As such I will always worship and adore her while I have breath. This was all, ma'am. I will be sworn to the best of my remembrance. I was in a passion with him myself, till I found he meant no harm. Indeed, Honor, says Sophia, I believe you have a real affection for me. I was provoked the other day when I gave you warning, but if you have a desire to stay with me, you shall. To be sure, ma'am, answered Mrs. Honor, I shall never desire to part with your ladyship. To be sure, I almost cried my eyes out when you gave me warning. It would be very ungrateful in me to desire to leave your ladyship, because as why, I should never get so good a place again. I am sure I would live and die with your ladyship. For, as poor Mr. Jones said, happy is the man. Here the dinner bell interrupted a conversation which had wrought such an effect on Sophia, that she was, perhaps, more obliged to her bleeding in the morning than she, at the time, had apprehended she should be. As to the present situation of her mind, I shall adhere to a rule of Horace, by not attempting to describe it, from despair of success. Most of my readers will suggest it easily to themselves, and the few who cannot would not understand the picture, or at least would deny it to be natural, if ever so well drawn.